Okay, excellent. I wanted to thank you all for having me today. This is a subject that I've worked on for quite some time. So I started studying tamarisk and fire back in 2006. And even though I've moved all the way to Pennsylvania, it's a subject that I'm still pursuing because it's just so interesting that it's worth going to the other side of the country to be warm for a little while. So even if that means 115 degrees. So today I'll be giving you a synthesis of my doctoral and continuing research on what happens when an invasive tree comes in and completely changes disturbance regimes. Okay. So as the world population increases, anthropogenic disturbances have drastically altered ecosystem structure and function. And this is particularly true of desert riparian ecosystems, which are valuable in both an ecological and economic way. So first of all, it's a stark contrast to the surrounding landscape. It's offering high diversity and productivity. It's good wildlife habitat, and it's the only place you can find water, which is important not only for human infrastructure, but for wildlife populations as well. And these systems are structured by flooding. So the life histories of native riparian species such as willow, which I'll be indicating as green and blue, so a couple different species, and cottonwood indicated in kind of a pinkish color. So their life histories are tied to this regular flooding disturbance regime, and they require specific frequency and intensity of flooding. And this is referred to as the flood pulse model. And on this hypothetical graph, we're looking at abundance or biomass over time. And as the flood occurs, you have a scouring of those native species from the riverbanks, which opens up room and allows the recruitment of young natives. So over time, this is going to increase the habitat complexity and the community composition. So human activities have modified desert riparian ecosystems primarily through damming. So you have these traditional systems with predictable flows that once they're dammed, those flows become unpredictable. And when you pair that with human disturbance, invasion, and climate change, this is going to cause large changes in ecosystem structure and function. So following damming, the flood pulse regime is replaced with less frequent flooding, and this hydrologic change will cause native species to decline in diversity, and it has also coincided with the introduction of an invasive species, which will be the focus of this talk. But as you can see with cottonwood species, they've been declining throughout the Southwestern states. And this is linked to this hydrologic change. But this invader is very well adapted to this altered regime. So this invader, Tamarisk, in the genus Tamarix, is native to Eurasia, and it was introduced in the United States in the 1800s as an ornamental because it is rather beautiful to look at. But they also introduced it for erosion control, which is done very well, actually. And it became invasive in the 1920s, even though it was introduced in the 1800s, so it kind of, there was a lag phase there. And when river regulation became very active, then it basically expanded. And basically what it does is it establishes following floods where scoured surfaces are colonized by large numbers of seedlings, and it causes monocultures like this one. And this picture, it's hard to tell how tall those trees actually are. They're probably on the order of 10 to 15 feet. So, you know, these are, they're fairly good size. I was taking the picture from high up. So Tamarisk is much better adapted to low water tables. It can handle drought. It can handle salty conditions. So with this change in hydrology, we saw that, or we're seeing that Tamarisk is starting to dominate, and native species are beginning to be excluded from the system. And what this has resulted in is more than 1.5 million acres of tamarisk, and it's basically, it has colonized all the major river drainages west of the Mississippi. And it's able to do so because it has all these different adaptations. So what does it do when it gets there? Well, first of all, it replaces habitats that have high vertical and horizontal heterogeneity that support a lot of wildlife populations. So it degrades habitats. It deposits salts on the soil. So right here you can see degraded soil where salts have been deposited. It has depleted groundwater in many areas, so it is capable of high evapotranspiration rates. You can see where the water level was. And then there are secondary invaders that are supported by tamarisk invading an area. But the primary focus of this talk is going to be increased wildfire risk, which has been, is becoming kind of an issue. So we all, as land managers, have probably recognized that riparian fires have become more frequent with tamarisk invasion. And Bush in 1995 was one of the first people to look at these patterns, and what his graph shows is fire area on the left axis and fire number on the right axis, and then year. So in general, what we see is an increase in both fire area and number. But this is interesting because native riparian zones, they're relatively fire resistant because those native species have high foliar moisture and those environments have high relative humidity. However, there's limited data on the patterns and mechanisms describing this because these fires were historically rare, and there's an issue where you can only study those fires after they have occurred, and you have to study them pretty soon because whenever there's a flood, it just wipes the system clean. So it's possible that tamarisk is introducing fire to a system that has never experienced it before. And tamarisk is highly flammable. So this is a look at an understory. We can see a very high fuel load. There's a lot of dead woody debris and fine fuels that accumulate throughout the vertical profile of that plant. And extreme fire behavior has been observed. Flame lengths of more than 40 meters, so that's more than 130 feet. They have been observed in closed canopy stands, and anything above 30 meters has been defined as extreme, which is going to result in loss of life and property. So we're talking about some pretty scary fires. And these fires, they can cover a large area. So it's possible that these fires may be altering community composition. But the question is, what is the mechanism driving this pattern? And that brings us to the first question. Is tamarisk invasion creating a fire cycle that further reduces native species and enhances its own success? So basically, is it choking out the native species? In order to address this, I looked at flammability, recovery, and fire intensity. So the first thing I investigated was whether tamarisk foliage was more flammable than the foliage of native species. And I used a slightly older method, mussel furnace, set at 650 degrees Celsius. And basically, it's a convective heat front that causes ignition. So I looked at the relationship between the foliage condition. I also looked at architecture and flammability. So to describe architecture, I actually developed a lacunarity index. So what lacunarity in normal language means is gappiness. So how many gaps are there between the different leaves, which in tamarisk are very tiny needle-like leaves. And what I saw was that you can see the T, that refers to tamarisk in this dark bar, and then the gray of the two different types of gray, these refer to two different willow species, and then cottonwood seen in this bar here. So what you can see is that tamarisk is much gappier, so it has a higher lacunarity index than the native species. So this is just a close-up view looking at the various air pockets that you're likely to see. And this is going to increase, as many fire managers know, the speed and probability of ignition. So when I looked at how long it took for those foliage samples to ignite, this graph shows time in seconds, and it's separated by species, cottonwood indicated by kind of that pink color, willow by that blue color, and then tamarisk indicated by red. So what the graph shows is that tamarisk ignites more quickly than the native species. But how does this translate to fire patterns at the landscape level? So to address this, I conducted a regional analysis of fire currents using GIS, and I used USGS gauge stations as a frame of reference. And those data actually provided tamarisk presence and absence data. I also included a combination of fire databases, MODIS, monitoring trends in burn severity, and I had help from a lot of different collaborators to find these fires. So in addition to simply looking at whether or not fires occurred in the vicinity of these gauges, I looked to see if the fires had burned up to the riparian corridor, and I called those fires barrier fires, or if they burned across the riparian corridor, and I called these conduit fires. And in many cases, you couldn't see whether or not some of those fires had stopped at the edge or not. So the data I'll be presenting looks at areas where it was clear that that had happened. So basically what I found when looking at fire occurrence in the left graph here, so that's the percent fire occurrence, I found that when tamarisk was present, that fires occurred more commonly. But the fires that are occurring without tamarisk in riparian zones, they become common too. So a lot of them were ignited by people. And in many cases, the fires occurred on or around the 4th of July. So you can kind of put that together, the source of ignition there. But I also looked at the fires stopping at the riparian corridor, because those were easy to see using satellite imagery. And what I found was that when tamarisk was present, fewer of those fires stopped at that riparian corridor. So that means that more of those fires actually crossed that barrier. But what does all this mean to the native species that are living there? So this is an important question for many of us that are trying to preserve the function of these important ecological communities. So in order to look at this, I studied the recovery of tamarisk and native riparian species through a 30-site survey. So I conducted a survey of sites that had burned within 5 to 10 years, and I chose sites that represented a gradient of native to tamarisk dominance, because I was interested in the effect of tamarisk-fueled fires on native vegetation consumption, and most especially on native recovery. So at each site, I characterized tamarisk and native density, and I looked at fuel structure that is separated into fuel classes, which are based on diameter. So the smaller fuel classes ignite more quickly than the larger fuel classes, and these are important used by land managers. I also looked at how tall they were. I tried to estimate other factors as well. But I also looked to see if they were live or dead. And in many cases, this is easy to see because these riparian species, even the natives, will resprout following fire. So the following images, I'm going to show you just a few places that I visited and some patterns that I saw. So at the San Pedro River Preserve, in an area with about 75% tall natives and 25% shorter tamarisk in the understory, and these estimates were based on adjacent areas that were unburned and similar in structure, and based on the occurrence of where the tree skeletons That's what I like to call them sometimes. The residual fuel that we see there are occurring. And what you see, those large trunks, those were cottonwoods for the most part, and most of them had died in this picture. And that red plant that you see resprouting there, and many of the red stems, that's all tamarisk. Here's an image that I took on the Rio Grande, and in this area there was about 50% tamarisk in the understory and about 50% native. There were quite a few willows underneath these cottonwoods, but there was very little evidence of those willows falling fire. And again, those red stems that you're seeing there, those are resprouting tamarisk, and all the cottonwoods in this image are dead. And this thing is frozen, I think.
Got to jump over to the next tab.
I forgot. Okay. Technology. So this is another area that was covered in 75% tamarisk and 25% natives before the fire. And you can see that the majority of what's left over is tamarisk, and there's quite a bit of those fluffy green resprouts there. In an area called Tokwapwash, there was 100% tamarisk, and you can see visible resprouting. And here's another place where there was about 100% tamarisk, and we saw a similar pattern of resprouting. So if we look at the amount of residual fuels, the residual fuels essentially being what's left over, and we look at tamarisk density separated into low, medium, and high groups, what we see is that fuel consumption, when tamarisk density increases, more fuel is consumed. So, and there seems to be this threshold when you go above 50% tamarisk cover where you get massive consumption of native species especially. And if we look at mortality, basically, I'm going to walk you through this figure here. So the figure was derived using logistic regression, where a binary response variable is examined along a gradient, and the probability of each binary variable can be estimated. So in this case, live and dead. So we examined the probability of native survival along a gradient of tamarisk density. So here's our tamarisk density here. And we found that native mortality increases as tamarisk cover increases. And you can see that for willow, shown here, that with very little tamarisk in the understory, you tend to have quite a bit of willow die-off. They're very sensitive to fire. And if we include tamarisk here, you can see that tamarisk mortality is much less density dependent. So tamarisk is a very tolerant species to fire. It resprouts vigorously from a root crown. So if we look at a fire cycle, okay, so in this case, community composition, whether tamarisk, shown in red, and natives, shown in green, is dominating essentially the community composition. So in this fire cycle diagram, when tamarisk is invaded and fire is introduced to an area, you get some natives resprouting and a lot of tamarisk resprouting. So with each subsequent fire, you have more tamarisk and fewer natives that are surviving, and it ends in a monoculture that burns in a 5 to 10 year fire cycle. But what is the mechanism driving this relationship? So fire intensity is a positive feedback in other invaded ecosystems. So I was interested in whether or not it was operating in the same way. So I conducted some prescribed burn experiments in 2 sites, a northern site in Humboldt Sink, so in northern Nevada, and a southern site in the Valley of Fire Wash. And the first fire in Humboldt took place in 2006, and the second in the Valley of Fire took place in 2008. And both of them were burned during the summer season. So in the different sites, I looked at fuel load, which I estimated through destructive sampling, and I estimated fire behavior. So this is looking at the fuel structure at the Humboldt sink. Here we have some understory, and this is what the fire looks like. And here's Valley of Fire wash in southern Nevada. And I'm going to use this person here for reference because we had a lot of pictures taken from high up. And this is what the understory looked like at Valley of Fire wash. So the fuel structures at these sites were different. On the Valley of Fire wash site, those trees had been there for at least 50 years, and the Humboldt sink site, those species had been there for at least 25 years, so they were younger. And this, you can see that same person down here for scale. So the fires were much, much more extreme. Okay, so this figure is showing flame lengths as a proxy for fire intensity, and we have the two sites with their biomass indicated within those bars. And what we see is that Valley of Fire had substantially more biomass per hectare than Humboldt, and basically the flame lengths were much taller. I'm just reminding you of what those flame lengths were. So to answer our first question, because Tamarisk is more flammable than native species and native survival decreases as Tamarisk density increases before fire, and we find that fire intensity is biomass dependent in Tamarisk-dominated monocultures, we can say that Tamarisk appears to be creating a fire cycle that further reduces native species and enhances its own success. So we have lower intensity fires that become higher intensity fires over time. So fire intensity is our positive feedback. But that brings us to a second question, which is more important from a management perspective, and this is whether the Tamarisk fire trajectory can be allowed, can allow the coexistence of native species. So in order to address this, I looked at physical and physiological effects of biological control. And biocontrol provided an interesting natural experiment where biotic and abiotic factors were altered in the cycle. So the agent that was introduced for Tamarisk biocontrol is the Tamarisk leaf beetle, Diorhabda, and this is native to Eurasia. Diorhabda consumes cuticle, as you can see in this image here. So it's a leaf scraping insect that consumes cuticle. This causes defoliation, and over time, it causes stress to the tree. But there's this concern that with defoliation and desiccation, that fire may be worse in areas where the beetle has invaded. So it may cause an already flammable situation to become worse. So to address the issue of desiccation, I conducted more muffle furnace trials where I compared the flammability of desiccated versus non-desiccated tamarisk. And I also desiccated natives because as altered hydrologies resulted in a massive die-off of native species, and there's dead standing biomass in some areas. And what you'll see is that in most cases, desiccated foliar materials, they ignite more quickly than non-desiccated foliar materials. But let's return to those prescribed burn experiments. So these are the same two prescribed burn sites I'm going to talk about, the first one being Humboldt. And I'm going to tell you the more in-depth story now. So at Humboldt, we conducted a summer, fall burn, and we had an unburn control. And this was in an area where there were 3 or more seasons of biological control. So it offered a gradient of desiccation at this site. So again, this is what that site looked like. And then Valley of Fire, in this area, we simulated the effect of an initial beetle colonization, and we had discrete desiccation levels that were simulated using herbicide. So here we can see desiccated and non-desiccated plots. Okay, and we took the same measurements as far as visual fire behavior measurements, but we also measured temperature and duration of the fire using data loggers and thermocouples. And we developed a fire intensity index that was an indication of heat damage by placing those thermocouples adjacent to that root crown where we would expect the most damage to occur. And this graph over here shows temperature over time. And many fire managers, they're capable of measuring maximum temperature or duration. But what we did is we took the area under that curve above 70 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature at which most plant tissues die. So by taking that area under the curve, that gave us an indication of how much fire damage to expect. So what we found was that foliar desiccation weather conditions actually influence fire intensity at the tree level more than desiccation. But if we focus just on the summer burn here, because we're comparing that Humboldt summer burn to the Valley of Fire herbicide experiment, what we see is that when the trees are more impacted or desiccated by either the herbivore in the case of Humboldt or by herbicide in the case of Valley of Fire, we do see some effect of desiccation. So we are interested in whether or not biocontrol herbivory could alter the system's response to fire. So here we have our Tamarisk fire cycle, where lower intensity fires, as Tamarisk starts to invade, become higher intensity and Tamarisk dominates. And we're interested in whether or not the system can be returned to a point where natives can at least coexist, where lower intensity fires are possible. So a concurrent experiment at the Humboldt site looked at stress using root crown carbohydrate sampling. And a summer burn was conducted, the fall burn and the control. So the summer burn, basically we were interested in how mortality was affected when carbohydrates like starches were being allocated to the leaves. So they're actively growing at the height of the summer season. In the fall, the carbohydrates are starting to be translocated to the tree's roots for dormancy. And in the control plots, we looked at just what the beetle damage was on its own. We hypothesized that we would get the greatest mortality in the summer burn because of higher burn temperatures and less storage in the roots in terms of starch. So this is what the Humboldt site looked like after 3 years of defoliation, and this is the time when the burn occurred. And just for fun, on vacation, I went to visit the same site 7 years after the fire to look at defoliation. So what we found is we took the percent starch, we measured percent starch in the root crowns of trees going from a low beetle impact, so green trees that were hardly impacted at all, to a high impact by the beetle where the trees were totally desiccated. And what we found was that we had lowered starch levels in the trees that were more highly impacted by the beetle. So as the beetle consumed their leaves, the trees spent energy from their root crowns in order to regrow those tissues and over time starve themselves. And incidentally, this is a similar relationship that was observed by Hudgens in the same site, where he looked at the amount of starch before the beetles were introduced, following the amount of starch after. So we can see that starch was reduced over time. But over time, this is causing physiological stress. And interestingly, if you extrapolate back on our graph to 0% herbivory, you get about the same 13% starch. So what we saw, and this is another logistic regression graph, was that the probability of mortality was higher in those trees that had much lower starch levels, those trees where the beetle had starved those roots. And here we're showing the control. So we saw that trees in the control treatment, beetle alone, more of them died the more beetle damage there was. The fall burn, we had a little bit more mortality. And then look at the summer burn. The probability of mortality in the summer burn was much higher. And this is due to much higher fire temperatures and much higher herbivory impact, reducing the amount of starch available for resprouting. But the shape of these curves suggests that there's an interesting interaction, and possibly that it might be synergistic. And synergy is a result that's greater than the sum of its parts. It's non-additive. We've seen this happening out west where the bark-boring beetles are enhancing post-fire mortality in conifers. So to ask this question whether or not they're synergistic, we applied a multiplicative risk model based on the additive theory of probability, that the probability of a combination of factors is equal to their individual effects added together, subtracting their interaction. So we came up with an equation to estimate if fire and herbivory are additive, then the following should be true. So if the observed mortality is greater than this mortality estimated, the factor should be synergistic. So M sub BF is equal to the mortality if fire and herbivory are additive, the probability of death due to biocontrol only was obtained from the control treatment. The probability of mortality due to fire alone was extrapolated to 0% using the logit function, so we know that our values were similar to Hudgens. And then we have the product of the probability due to biocontrol alone and the probability due to fire alone. So this graph shows what we found. So our predicted values in the fall were not too much more. They're almost exactly the same that you would predict in the control. The predicted values in the summer were much lower than the actual observed values. So this indicates that they're interacting synergistically. Just how much synergism? We can see the shaded area represents the synergism that we observed. And in the summer, the shaded area is much larger. And it shows that if you're a summer tree, it takes less beetle damage to kill you if you get burned. Okay, so to answer a question of whether or not we can alter this fire cycle to allow coexistence of natives, once the beetle is introduced, we expect greater Tamarisk mortality and some native recovery. When this happens, over time, lower intensity fires are going to replace those higher intensity fires. Because as Tamarisk dies back, there will be less biomass over time to burn. So the synergism may allow coexistence. So why is coexistence important? So coexistence may be enough to restore some wildlife habitat value. And this is important because of species like the Southwestern willow flycatcher, which are endangered and have been nesting in Tamarisk. But you only need about 20 to 40% native cover to support native bird populations. But if you look at my data, you need at least 50%, probably more native species because of that 50% threshold at which the fires become very intense and consume all those native materials and increase mortality. But it's really, really important to include fuel structure in habitat management plans. So one of the fires that I visited was a protected Southwestern willow flycatcher habitat, and unfortunately it was extremely flammable, and by protecting it, we had this huge fire that just ripped through and destroyed all the habitat. So this really needs to be considered. So what should we expect over time? So we should be expecting more frequent fires with more extreme fire behaviors in areas following the beetle's initial defoliation. But as the Tamarisk foliage drops and the trees die back, we expect that fire frequency and intensity should decrease. And in some areas, we're starting to see some positive effects of the beetle. So this picture shows resprouting tamarisk that is being defoliated by beetles, and we have species here like the willows that are starting to come back. So Southwestern riparian systems are a prime example of an ecosystem that is difficult to manage due to changes in hydrology, tamarisk invasion, and novel fire disturbance. With climate change on the horizon, what's in store for this system? So are there going to be more native fires that are fueled by native vegetation? So why is all this important, and how is the beetle involved in this? So biocontrol has the potential to preserve some ecological and economic value in this highly modified system. Are we ever going to get rid of tamarisk completely? Probably not. It's in the landscape. It's tenacious. It's hard to get rid of. But given complex issues that land managers are facing, biocontrol may help. They may be more of an ecosystem duct tape where they're effective for about an hour, but they're not really permanent. But nevertheless, there's amazing potential for large-scale influences. And given the importance of this ecosystem, this can't be ignored. So with that, I will open this forum to questions if we have time.
Yes, we definitely have time. That was a great presentation, Gail. Very interesting, and thank you for walking us through it in a clear way. That really helped. So let's see. Barb early on had a question about the interaction between tamarisk beetle and fire, but I think that was pretty well covered, unless, Barb, you want to type in more of a question. Yeah, that's what I thought. I think we'll leave the participants muted because we have so many people interested in the topic that it might be a cacophony if we unmute the line. So while we're waiting for other folks to type in other questions, I guess I personally, I'm just curious, Gail, whether your, and this may not be based on data, but whether your sort of gut feeling is what you've observed with the spread of the tamarisk leaf beetle and some of the recovery, whether you're sort of optimistic, whether this sort of synergy can move across large areas towards that more of a balance as you showed in some of the last graphs, or whether you're pessimistic because of the sort of predicted increase in heat and dryness.
You know, I think that's kind of a hard question to answer, but I think it's highly context dependent. I think there are some areas that are going to benefit from this, and these would be areas that are lower on the floodplain, those areas that may be less regulated, such as the Virgin River, where you still have some flooding. I think that it's going to allow a lot of passive recovery, but in some of these other areas where, for example, the Valley of Fire Wash, which we just burned, look at fire behavior, we did not really care about mortality in that one because we were, we knew all of them were going to come back, and they did. Basically, you run into the issue of, with the hydrology being such an issue, is it better to have tamarisk there and instead of absolutely nothing living there? I mean, these are things that going around have really brought some interesting questions to mind. I think definitely if you can promote native restoration in areas, I think the beetle will help you do that. But in some of these other areas, I don't know. I mean, it's a real issue.
Thanks, and thanks for being willing to go a little bit out on a limb there. So Matthew asked a question about the need for hydrology to allow recolonization of natives, and you sort of just touched on it in your last comments, but I wonder if you might expand on that.
So people that have been working with us, I'm with St. Francis University now, but I got my doctorate at UC Santa Barbara under the direction of Tom Dudley and Carla D'Antonio. So I worked out west. I've already forgotten the question.
Hydrology, the need for hydrology to allow recolonization by natives.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. So basically we had a group working together from all kinds of universities and groups throughout the Southwest, and they did some restoration trials out in the Virgin River area. And even though the plots were small, there was some hope that if you can establish areas with enough natives, like maybe even patches, if you restore that hydrology, perhaps you can use those natives as propagule sources So, as tamarisk abatement activities continue, so long as you have those propagule sources and the water to carry those propagules, then I think you'll be pretty successful.
Great, and that may kind of feed into Amanda's question about recommendations for restoring a more natural fire regime. And she's sort of wondering about other options that can be used to supplement beetle herbivory. So I might throw in there, would you add in thinning in addition, or are there other things that need to occur at the same time?
So, yeah, this is a really difficult thing. Again, I think it depends on what your environmental conditions are, but I think if you have the funding to do multiple treatments, I think it's important. Some of our collaborators at Lake Mead, they've been having a lot of success with basil sprays, so Garlon 4. They've gotten up to 80% mortality in some areas of doing those basil sprays. And I think in some cases, if there's some dead tamarisk in the overstory, you might actually have some nurse plant interactions occurring. And this is something that I don't have data to support, but I went back to the Lovelock site, so the Humboldt site, 7 years after the original experiment, and what I saw was kind of interesting. In those sites that had a little bit more fuel structure left, you tended to get more native colonization. So, and more interestingly, it was actually in the fall burn plots where more of those fuels had survived that had happened. So it may be an important consideration to leave some of that, that structure in order to allow those natives to establish. So I think you do need to do it in stages and think about what the requirements are for these other species that you're planting. So I don't know if that helps.
No, I think that's a good answer, and I think Patty's question fits in with this as well. And she asks, is there any good logic to retaining dense tamarisk patches of quarter acre or larger in an otherwise healthy native riparian area in order to protect habitat for willow flycatchers, especially with respect to fire and increasing density of tamarisk with time?
Yeah, that depends a lot on the structure of that habitat. So as we know, or at least those of us who've worked with tamarisk know, that the younger plants have a much different habitat structure than larger plants. So, I would assume that if there are some larger plants, you are going to be running into that issue of a lot of materials in that understory that are accumulating and increasing the fire hazard. But if you can keep those stands a little bit thinned out and maybe even adjacent to some native vegetation, it could be possible if those birds are using tamarisk, but then you run the risk of the tamarisk as being a propagule source. So that's always an issue.
Great. And then Sean Stone asks about large fire breaks and how they could be used in order to protect areas from wildfire and systems that have not yet been defoliated. So again, kind of touching on this protection of willow flycatcher habitat, maybe in an interim, but nonetheless wanting to maintain it without fire.
Okay, so just to give you an idea, our small fires up in the Humboldt site, with their flame lengths being relatively low, we were actually able to bulldoze fire breaks, and I believe those fire breaks were about 10 meters apiece, and that seemed to be enough to at least handle burning individual plots at the time. We did have a couple escapes, but we were able, with a very small crew of us, to put it out so that we didn't burn other plots. But I mean, we're talking about flame lengths of, not even 10 meters in most cases. But in the Valley of Fire burn, you're talking about maximum flame lengths over 130 feet. So, and then you have firebrands that can travel anywhere from half a mile to a mile. I just don't know that you would have enough equipment to bulldoze the fire breaks that you would need to inhibit fire spread in these areas. Plus, if you have it in more of a valley situation, I just don't know how you would control that spread. I don't know if that's too much doom and gloom.
Well, you got to be honest. Let's see. So Jason asks a question about removing. He mentions that he's been removing tamarisk through mastication, and they also have the beetle. And so he's wondering about the applicability of mastication as an analog for fire. And he mentions that his small riparian area was already dominated by tamarisk. And asks, should we get ahead of tamarisk by replanting natives while the beetles do their work?
So that's a really interesting question and something that I've been very interested in recently. There was another fire that occurred, it was during the dormant season, and I would assume that if you're masticating, it's almost like you're leaving that the underground structures, you're pretty much leaving them intact, right? I haven't masticated an area. But you can kind of think of mastication as being a low-intensity fire where maybe you're not damaging the root crown at all. But with the beetles coming in, it wasn't thought originally that the beetles would ever colonize the resprouts, as they have this preference for taller branches. But when that's the only food there for them to consume, we have seen them consume a lot of resprouts, and that's what they were doing in the Meadow Valley Wash area. So I think that if you have enough beetles in an area, I think you can definitely start replanting natives. You're still going to have to deal with tamarisk hanging around there for a while, but yeah, I think if you do have that funding to do mastication, which is extremely expensive, I definitely understand that. I think that a combination of methods like that, the beetle coming in, maybe if you could come in and supplement with a little bit of basil spray, you could probably get a pretty good recovery, assuming that you have some access to groundwater. Does that answer the question?
I think so. I think you've sort of highlighted there's a suite of options, and obviously it's site-specific which ones are and funding, which ones are most applicable. But it's neat to think that there's some options now.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that a lot of, initially I had recommended, I think in my first publication with International Journal of Wildfire, to get the maximum tamarisk mortality to burn at the height of the fire season, essentially. Well, that's extremely dangerous, and you can't do that in areas that are adjacent to human infrastructure. But fall burns could be feasible, and seeing what I've seen now, that even though you get the lower mortality initially, you tend to get more colonization by native species afterwards. I mean, that could be a real option.
Neat. Those long-term questions, I'm sure you'll be watching this for a while, because it seems like the long-term questions are pretty interesting.
Yep, it's one of those things that I'm probably never going to get away from, even if I keep moving across the country. It's just too interesting.
Well, great, and we're just about at the top of the hour here, so unless somebody has a last question, I think we'll wrap it up here. But Gail, I want to thank you again. You did a great job both in the presentation and also with your careful answers to our questions. So thank you so much. And for all of those who participated, thank you for joining us. We'll make the recording available and we'll send it out to participants. You can share that with your colleagues. And I hope to see you on future webinars.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gail.
Bye.